There is something about Keanu Reeves that stays with you long after you have seen him on screen. It is not just his talent or his famous roles. It is the way he moves through the world with a quiet grace that most people in his position never find. In a world obsessed with fame and flash and showing off every success, Keanu chooses silence. He chooses humility. He chooses kindness even when no one is watching. I have followed his journey for years, and what strikes me most is not what he has achieved, but what he has survived. He lost his best friend to an overdose. He lost his daughter just days after she was born. He lost the love of his life in a tragic accident. Any one of these losses could break a person forever, but Keanu did not let pain turn him bitter. Instead, he became softer. He became more generous. He became the kind of man who gives up his seat on the subway for strangers, who takes pay cuts so film crews can keep their jobs, who treats every single person he meets with genuine respect. That is why he inspires me, not because he is a movie star, but because he proves that success does not have to steal your soul. You can reach the highest peaks of fame and still remember where you came from. You can carry unbearable grief and still choose to spread joy. You can have every reason to be cold and distant and still decide to be warm. Keanu Reeves reminds me that kindness is not weakness. It is the greatest strength a person can possess, and that is exactly what this story is about. The air inside the Toronto airport felt different that night. It was not something Patricia could explain with words, just a strange heaviness that settled over her chest as she walked toward the boarding gate. The lights above her seemed dimmer than usual, casting soft shadows across the polished floors. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughed, and the sound echoed through the terminal like a memory from another time. Patricia paused for a moment, her worn leather bag pressing against her hip, and she took a slow breath. Something felt uncertain tonight, though she could not say what or why. At 78 years old, Patricia Reeves had learned to trust these quiet feelings. Life had taught her that the smallest moments often carried the greatest weight. She had raised her son alone through years of struggle, working double shifts as a costume designer in Hollywood while other mothers slept. Her hands still remembered the needle pricks and late-night sewing sessions, the fabric cuts and endless alterations that had put food on their table. Those same hands now showed the truth of her years, the skin thin and marked with the beautiful evidence of a life fully lived. She could have flown first class. Her son had offered countless times, practically begging her to let him upgrade her tickets, to let him take care of her the way she had always taken care of him. But Patricia was a stubborn woman in the best possible way. She believed that comfort was earned through honest work, not handed down through fame or fortune. Besides, she had spent most of her life in economy class, and she found a strange peace in the cramped seats and recycled air. It reminded her of who she was before everything changed, before her quiet son became one of the most beloved actors in the world. Tonight she was flying home to Los Angeles after visiting old friends in Canada. It was a simple trip, nothing special, just an elderly woman traveling alone on a late-night flight. She had no idea that the next few hours would change several lives forever. She had no idea that kindness and cruelty would collide at 35,000 feet. And she certainly had no idea that her son was already on the plane, sitting quietly in seat 14C, watching the world the way he always did, with patient eyes and a gentle heart. The boarding call echoed through the terminal, and Patricia gathered her things slowly. Her arthritis had been worse lately, making every movement a small negotiation between her will and her body. She joined the line of passengers shuffling toward the gate, just another face in the crowd, completely invisible to anyone who did not know her story. And that was exactly how she preferred it. Fame had never interested Patricia. She had seen what it could do to people, how it could twist them into versions of themselves they no longer recognized. She had watched her son navigate that treacherous world with remarkable grace, and she thanked God every day that the spotlight had not stolen his soul. The plane was a large aircraft, filled with tired travelers seeking sleep and business people clutching laptops like lifelines. Patricia made her way down the narrow aisle, counting seat numbers under her breath, her bag bumping gently against the armrests as she passed. The overhead compartments were already filling up, passengers stuffing luggage into spaces too small to hold them. When she finally reached her row, she stopped and looked up at the compartment above her seat. It was almost full, but there was just enough room for her small bag if she could lift it high enough. She really tried. Her arms trembled as she raised the bag, her shoulders screaming in protest, her fingers struggling to maintain their grip. The bag was not heavy by normal standards, but for Patricia it might as well have been filled with stones. She felt the eyes of other passengers on her, felt their impatience radiating like heat from a fire. Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, and she hated that feeling more than the pain in her joints. She had never wanted to be a burden to anyone. And then the bag slipped. It tumbled from her grasp and landed on the floor with a soft thud, spilling a few of its contents across the aisle. A paperback book, a small bag of mints, and a photograph in a simple frame. Patricia looked down at the scattered items, and for a moment she felt like crying. It was such a small thing, really, just a dropped bag on an airplane. But sometimes the small things carry all the weight of the world. A young flight attendant appeared beside her almost instantly. Her name tag read Madison, and she was beautiful in the sharp and polished way that airlines seem to prefer. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a perfect bun, her makeup flawless, her uniform pressed and pristine. She looked like she belonged on a magazine cover, not walking the aisles of a cramped airplane. But her eyes told a different story. They were tired and stressed, carrying shadows that her smile could not quite hide. Madison looked at the scattered items on the floor, then at Patricia, and something shifted in her expression. It was subtle but unmistakable, a flicker of irritation that hardened into something colder. She did not bend down to help. She did not offer a kind word or a reassuring touch. Instead, she turned to a colleague standing a few feet away and spoke in a voice that was just loud enough to be heard. "Great," she said with a sigh that carried more weight than any shout. "Another confused old lady who cannot handle basic travel. This is going to be a long night." The words hit Patricia like a slap across the face. She felt them sink into her skin, burning with a heat that had nothing to do with temperature. Around her, other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting away as if witnessing something they wished they had not seen. Patricia bent down slowly to gather her things, her hands trembling now for a different reason entirely. She had been dismissed. She had been mocked. She had been made to feel small and worthless by a stranger who knew nothing about her life. What Madison did not notice, what she could not possibly have known, was that a man in seat 14C had removed his baseball cap. He had been watching the entire scene unfold, his dark eyes taking in every detail with the quiet intensity of someone who had learned to observe before acting. His jaw tightened as he heard Madison's words, and his hands gripped the armrests of his seat with barely contained emotion. Keanu Reeves said nothing, not yet, but something inside him had shifted, a protective instinct as old as his first memories of watching his mother work through exhaustion to give him a better life. He remembered every sacrifice she had made, every meal she had skipped so he could eat, every dream she had set aside so his could flourish. And now he watched as a stranger treated her like she was nothing, like her 78 years of love and labor meant nothing at all. In first class, another passenger had witnessed everything as well. Victor Aldridge was a man of 62 years, with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He was the chief operations officer of the airline, traveling anonymously to evaluate staff performance without their knowledge. It was a practice he had adopted years ago after too many polished reports failed to match the reality of customer experience. Tonight he had expected to see minor issues, small problems easily fixed with better training. He had not expected to witness something that would test everything he believed about second chances and accountability. Victor pulled out his phone and began recording. He was not sure why exactly. Perhaps it was instinct. Perhaps it was the journalist he had once dreamed of becoming before business school changed his path. Whatever the reason, he captured everything: Madison's words, Patricia's wounded expression, and the quiet man in economy class whose face was about to change this flight forever. Patricia finally settled into her seat, her belongings gathered and stored with the help of a kind stranger across the aisle. She folded her hands in her lap and stared out the window at the darkness beyond, her reflection looking back at her like a ghost. She told herself that Madison's words did not matter. She told herself that the opinion of a stressed young woman should not have the power to hurt her. But the truth was simpler and sadder. Words always have power. Kindness lifts us up. Cruelty tears us down. And tonight, Patricia felt more alone than she had in years. The plane began to taxi toward the runway, engines humming with building power. Passengers settled into their seats, some already closing their eyes, others staring at phones that would soon be switched off. In seat 14C, Keanu Reeves watched his mother through the gap between headrests, his heart aching with a love that time had only strengthened. He wanted to go to her immediately. He wanted to wrap his arms around her and tell her that she was the most important person in his life, that everything he had become was because of her sacrifice and strength. But something held him back. A quiet voice in his mind suggested that patience might reveal more than action. He had learned over the years that the truth of a person often emerges slowly, like a photograph developing in a darkroom. Perhaps Madison was simply having a terrible night. Perhaps she would find her kindness before the flight was over. Keanu wanted to believe in the goodness of people because his mother had taught him to believe exactly that. As the plane lifted into the sky and the lights of Toronto faded below, Patricia closed her eyes and tried to sleep. She did not know that her son was watching over her. She did not know that a powerful executive was documenting everything. She did not know that the young woman who had hurt her was carrying wounds of her own, invisible burdens that would soon be revealed. All she knew was that the air felt heavy tonight, and somewhere deep inside her, a quiet voice whispered that this flight was going to be different from any she had taken before. The cabin lights dimmed, and the darkness wrapped around the passengers like a blanket. Somewhere above the clouds, kindness and cruelty were about to collide, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The cabin had grown quieter now, that particular stillness that settles over a plane when the lights dim and passengers surrender to the hum of engines. Patricia sat motionless in her seat, her eyes closed but her mind refusing to rest. The words still echoed inside her head, bouncing off the walls of her thoughts like stones thrown into a well. Confused old lady. Cannot handle basic travel. She had heard unkind words before in her 78 years, but something about tonight made them cut deeper than usual. Perhaps it was the weariness in her bones. Perhaps it was the loneliness of traveling alone at an age when most people had someone to hold their hand. Whatever the reason, sleep would not come, and Patricia found herself lost in memories instead. She thought about the tiny apartment in Beirut where she had first become a mother. She thought about the fear and the joy and the overwhelming love that had flooded her heart when she held her baby boy for the first time. She had been so young then, so uncertain about everything except one truth. She would do anything to give her child a good life. She would work until her fingers bled. She would sacrifice every comfort and every dream if it meant he could have chances she never had. And she had kept that promise through years of struggle, through a failed marriage, through moves across countries and continents, through jobs that paid barely enough to survive. Now that baby boy was one of the most famous actors in the world, and Patricia still insisted on flying economy class. Some people thought she was eccentric. Others thought she was proud in a stubborn and foolish way. But the truth was simpler than that. Patricia flew economy because she never wanted to forget where she came from. She never wanted comfort to make her soft or success to make her blind to the struggles of ordinary people. Her son understood this about her. It was one of the many things he had inherited from her quiet wisdom. 3 rows behind Patricia, Keanu Reeves sat in the darkness with his thoughts racing faster than the plane cutting through clouds. He had watched his mother settle into her seat with that particular stillness she adopted when she was hurt but refusing to show it. He knew that stillness intimately. He had seen it when his father left them. He had seen it when money ran out and dinner was whatever could be scraped together from an almost empty refrigerator. He had seen it when she smiled through exhaustion and told him everything would be fine, even when they both knew she was lying to protect him. The flight attendant named Madison had disappeared into the galley at the front of the plane, probably preparing for the beverage service that would come soon. Keanu found himself wondering about her, about what kind of person could speak so carelessly about a stranger. He wanted to believe she was not cruel by nature. He wanted to believe that something had simply broken inside her tonight, some invisible pressure that had cracked her kindness like ice on a warming pond. But even as he thought these generous thoughts, anger simmered beneath them. That was his mother Madison had mocked. His mother who had given everything so he could become something. His mother who deserved respect simply for surviving the life she had survived with grace intact. In first class, Victor Aldridge had put away his phone, but his mind continued recording everything. He had been with the airline for over 30 years, climbing from a customer service representative to the second highest position in the entire company. He had seen employees at their best and their worst. He had witnessed acts of extraordinary kindness and moments of shameful failure. But something about tonight felt different, heavier somehow, like the universe had arranged this flight specifically to teach someone an important lesson. He just was not sure yet who the student was supposed to be. The beverage cart emerged from the galley with Madison pushing it down the narrow aisle. Her colleague, an older woman named Helen, walked beside her taking orders and passing drinks with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times before. They worked in silence mostly, the tension between them obvious to anyone paying attention. Helen had witnessed Madison's earlier comments, and her disapproval hung in the air like smoke that refused to clear. When they reached Patricia's row, Helen leaned down with a warm smile. "What can I get for you tonight, sweetheart?" she asked in a voice that carried genuine care. "Some water, perhaps, or maybe a nice cup of tea to help you sleep." Patricia opened her eyes and managed a small smile in return. "Tea would be lovely," she said softly. "Thank you for asking so kindly." Madison stood behind the cart with her arms crossed, watching this exchange with visible impatience. Her foot tapped against the floor in a rhythm that spoke of irritation barely contained. When Helen took longer than usual preparing the tea, making sure it was the perfect temperature, and adding a small cookie to the napkin, Madison let out a sigh loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "We have an entire plane to serve," Madison said through a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Perhaps we could move things along instead of running a personal tea service." Helen straightened up and looked at her young colleague with an expression that mixed disappointment with something close to pity. She said nothing in response, simply handed Patricia her tea with an extra gentle touch and moved the cart forward. But the damage was done. Passengers in surrounding seats exchanged uncomfortable glances. A businessman across the aisle shook his head slowly, and Patricia's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the cup, tea splashing over the rim and onto her fingers. Keanu watched all of this through the gap between seats, his jaw tight and his heart pounding against his ribs. He remembered something his mother had told him when he was young and struggling with bullies at school. She had said that hurt people, that cruelty often flows from wounds we cannot see. She had taught him to look for the pain behind the anger, to seek understanding before judgment. He had carried that lesson through his entire life, and it had made him the man he was today. But watching his mother be mistreated tested that lesson severely. Some protective instinct deep inside him screamed to act, to stand up and defend her the way she had always defended him. Yet he remained still, waiting, watching, giving Madison one more chance to find her better self before the night was over. The next hour passed slowly, the plane cutting through darkness toward a distant dawn. Passengers dozed and stirred and dozed again. Flight attendants moved through the cabin checking seatbelts and collecting trash. Patricia managed to drink half her tea before her stomach began to feel strange, a queasy sensation that reminded her of seasickness, though she had not been on a boat in years. She pressed the call button above her seat, the small orange light blinking in the dimness like a tiny distress signal. Minutes passed. The light continued blinking. Patricia pressed the button again, embarrassment warming her cheeks as she imagined what the other passengers must think of her. Twice in one flight she had drawn attention to herself. Twice she had been that passenger, the difficult one, the needy one, the old woman who could not simply sit quietly and cause no trouble. Madison finally appeared beside her seat, but she did not crouch down to hear Patricia's concern. She stood with her hip cocked against the armrest across the aisle, her body language broadcasting annoyance in every possible way. "Yes," she said flatly. "What is it now?" Patricia swallowed her pride and spoke softly so other passengers would not hear. "I am not feeling very well," she said. "My stomach is upset and I feel a bit dizzy. I was wondering if perhaps you might have something that could help. Some ginger ale maybe, or a cool cloth for my forehead." Madison stared at her for a long moment, her expression unchanged. Then she spoke in a voice that made no effort to be quiet, a voice that carried through the cabin like a sharp wind cutting through still air. "Ma'am, this is not a nursing home. I cannot keep running over here every time you need attention. If you are too unwell to fly, perhaps you should have stayed home instead of making my job more difficult than it already is." The words landed in the silence like bombs exploding in slow motion. Passengers throughout the cabin turned to stare, their faces reflecting shock and second-hand embarrassment, and in some cases poorly hidden outrage. An elderly man a few rows back muttered something under his breath. A young mother covered her daughter's ears as if profanity had been spoken. And Helen, standing near the galley entrance, closed her eyes in what looked like pain. Patricia felt tears building behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had not cried in public since her son's daughter was stillborn, since she had held Keanu as he sobbed, and tried to find words that did not exist for such impossible grief. She would not give this young woman the satisfaction of seeing her break. So she simply nodded once, turned her face toward the window, and said nothing at all. In seat 14C, Keanu had heard enough. He stood up slowly, his tall frame unfolding in the dim cabin light. He removed the baseball cap he had been wearing since Toronto, ran his fingers through his dark hair, and stepped into the aisle. Passengers who had been watching the scene with Madison suddenly went still, a ripple of recognition passing through the cabin like electricity through water. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Someone else fumbled for their phone before remembering it was supposed to be in airplane mode. But Keanu paid no attention to any of them. His eyes were fixed on Madison, who had not yet turned to see who was approaching. "Excuse me," Keanu said, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that filled the entire space around them. Madison spun around with an irritated expression already forming on her face, ready to dismiss another demanding passenger. But when she saw who was standing before her, the color drained from her cheeks so quickly it seemed like a magic trick. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed, then opened again. No words came out. Keanu let the silence stretch for a moment, let her feel the full weight of being recognized by someone whose face was known around the entire world. Then he spoke again, and every passenger within earshot held their breath to hear. "That woman you have been speaking to so unkindly is my mother," Keanu said slowly. "Her name is Patricia. She raised me alone while working double shifts as a costume designer. She taught me that kindness costs nothing and cruelty costs everything. She sacrificed more than you could ever know so that I could have a chance at my dreams." Madison's hand flew to her mouth as the reality of what she had done began to sink in. She looked from Keanu to Patricia and back again, her eyes wide with a horror that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her soul. Around them, passengers were openly staring now, some filming with phones they had sneaked out of pockets, others simply frozen in the presence of something they would tell their grandchildren about someday. Keanu took a step closer to Madison, and she flinched slightly as if expecting anger to finally explode. But when he spoke again, his voice remained calm, almost gentle despite the steel beneath the surface. "I am going to sit with my mother now," he said. "I am going to hold her hand and make sure she knows that she is loved and valued and worthy of respect. And you are going to think about the kind of person you want to be. Because right now, you are breaking hearts that have already been broken too many times before." He moved past Madison without another word, sliding into the empty seat beside Patricia. She looked at him with surprise that melted quickly into understanding, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. He took her hand in his, those hands that had once changed his diapers and bandaged his scrapes, and applauded his first school play when the other parents looked bored. "Hi, Mom," he whispered. "I am here now. Everything is going to be okay." Patricia leaned her head against his shoulder the way she had not done since he was small enough to fit in her lap. "I knew you were on this plane," she murmured. "I felt you watching over me." In first class, Victor Aldridge had witnessed the entire confrontation. His phone had captured everything, though he had not planned to film any more tonight. His mind was racing through company policies, termination procedures, public relations implications. Madison had just mistreated a passenger in full view of dozens of witnesses, and that passenger happened to be the mother of one of the most beloved celebrities on the planet. This was a disaster of unprecedented proportions. This was exactly the kind of incident that destroyed careers and generated lawsuits and made headlines around the world. He pressed the call button to summon the head flight attendant. Decisions would need to be made before this plane touched ground in Los Angeles. Someone was going to pay for what had happened tonight, and Victor Aldridge was going to make sure of it. But as he waited for the attendant to arrive, something strange happened. He found himself looking at Madison, really looking at her for the first time all night. He saw a young woman standing frozen in the aisle, her hands shaking at her sides, her face showing not defiance but devastation. He saw someone who had just watched her entire future collapse in a matter of seconds. And somewhere in his businessman's heart, a small voice asked a question he did not want to consider. What if punishment was not the only answer? What if there was another way? The plane continued through the darkness, carrying passengers toward a destination none of them could have imagined when they boarded. Keanu sat with his mother, their hands intertwined, their silence speaking louder than words. Madison stood alone in the aisle, surrounded by staring eyes and the weight of her own terrible choices. And in first class, a powerful man wrestled with questions about justice and mercy that had no easy answers. Outside the windows, stars burned in the infinite black, indifferent to the small dramas playing out below. But inside this metal tube hurtling through space, something was shifting. Hearts were opening. Truths were emerging, and the turbulence was only just beginning. The cabin had gone completely silent after Keanu sat beside his mother. Not the comfortable silence of sleep or relaxation, but the thick, heavy kind that settles when everyone is holding their breath, afraid to make a sound. Passengers who had been dozing moments before now sat perfectly still, eyes darting between Keanu and Madison like spectators at a tennis match where every point carried life-changing consequences. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the hum of the engines seemed quieter somehow, as if the plane itself was listening. Madison stood frozen in the aisle, her hands trembling at her sides, her face pale under the dim cabin lights. She looked like someone who had just woken from a nightmare only to realize it was real. Her eyes kept flicking toward Keanu, then back to Patricia, then down to her own shoes as if searching for an escape route that did not exist. Around her, the other flight attendants had stopped moving entirely. Helen stood near the galley with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Another attendant named Carlos hovered nearby, his phone half hidden behind his back, clearly recording everything despite airline policy. In first class, Victor Aldridge pressed his call button again, harder this time. He needed answers. He needed control. He needed to know exactly how badly this situation was going to damage his company's reputation. Within seconds, the head flight attendant, a woman named Diane with 20 years of experience etched into the lines around her eyes, appeared beside his seat. "Sir," she whispered, leaning close so others would not overhear. "I am aware of what happened. We are handling it." Victor lowered his voice to match hers. "Who is she?" he asked, nodding toward Madison. "How long has she worked for us?" Diane hesitated. 6 months, sir. She is still on probation. This is her third long-haul flight." Victor's jaw tightened. "And you allowed her to work customer service without proper oversight." Diane looked away for a moment, shame coloring her cheeks. "We were short-staffed tonight, sir. Madison volunteered for the extra shift. She has never shown behavior like this before." Before Victor could respond, his phone buzzed silently in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. His assistant had sent him a message. Keanu Reeves' mother incident video already leaked, trending on Twitter. #FireMedicine has 50,000 posts in the last 10 minutes. Victor closed his eyes for a brief moment. This was worse than he had imagined. Much worse. Social media moved faster than any crisis management team could react. By the time they landed in Los Angeles, Madison's name would be known around the world. Her face would be everywhere. Her life as she knew it would be over. He looked up at Diane. "Get her off the floor. Now, and bring me her personnel file before we land." Diane nodded and hurried away, her heels clicking softly against the carpeted aisle. Victor watched her go, then turned his attention back to economy class. Keanu was speaking softly to his mother now, his hand still wrapped around hers. Patricia had closed her eyes again, but this time she looked peaceful, her breathing slow and steady. Whatever fear or embarrassment she had felt earlier seemed to have melted away in the presence of her son. Madison, meanwhile, had been gently guided to a jump seat near the rear galley by Helen. She sat with her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking slightly. Helen crouched beside her, speaking in low tones that no one else could hear. Whatever she was saying, it did not seem to be helping. Madison looked like a person who had just watched her entire future disappear. Keanu glanced toward the back of the plane, his eyes finding Madison's hunched form. For a moment, something unreadable passed across his face. Not anger, not satisfaction, something deeper, something sadder. Then he turned back to his mother and whispered something that made her smile faintly. Outside the windows, the first hints of dawn were beginning to color the horizon. The plane was descending now, cutting through layers of cloud toward the sprawling lights of Los Angeles below. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and professional, announcing their approach to LAX. "Fasten your seatbelts. Prepare for landing. Thank you for flying with us." No one applauded. No one smiled. The usual relief that comes with nearing the end of a long flight was absent. Instead, tension hung in the air like fog, thick and suffocating. As the plane banked gently to begin its final approach, Victor stood up and walked slowly toward the rear of the cabin. Passengers watched him pass, some recognizing him from corporate photos, others simply sensing his authority from the way he carried himself. He stopped beside Madison's jump seat and waited until Helen stepped aside. "Madison," he said quietly, "look at me." She lifted her head slowly, her eyes red and swollen, her makeup smudged from tears she had tried to hide. When she saw who was standing before her, fresh panic flooded her expression. "Mr. Aldridge," she whispered, I didn't know." I know you didn't, Victor interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. That does not change what happened, or what will happen next. Madison swallowed hard. I am going to lose my job, aren't I? Victor did not answer immediately. He studied her face, really studied it, looking past the fear and shame to the person beneath. She was young, yes. Foolish, certainly. But there was something else there too, something raw and real that he had not expected to find. Tell me about yourself, Madison, he said finally. Not as an employee, as a person. Why did you snap tonight? Madison blinked, clearly surprised by the question. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. For a long moment she said nothing. Then so quietly that Victor had to lean closer to hear, she began to speak. My mom has dementia, she whispered, early onset. She is only 63, I am her primary caregiver. I work 3 jobs just to pay for her medication and the home health aide who watches her while I am at work. Tonight was supposed to be my day off, but Carlos called in sick and they begged me to cover. I haven't slept properly in weeks. I am so tired all the time, and tonight I just broke. Her voice cracked on the last word, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. Helen reached out and squeezed her shoulder gently, but Madison did not seem to notice. She was staring at her lap now, her hands clenched into fists. I don't expect forgiveness, she continued, her voice barely audible. I was cruel. I was unprofessional. I hurt someone who didn't deserve it. I know what I did was wrong. I didn't think anyone would care enough to notice. Victor let out a slow breath. He had heard many excuses in his 30 years with the airline. Most of them were lies designed to avoid responsibility. But this felt different. This felt true. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed again. Another message from his assistant. News outlets are calling. They want a statement. Public is demanding immediate termination. Some are calling for criminal charges. Victor sighed and put the phone away. He looked at Madison one more time, then turned and walked back toward first class. He had decisions to make, difficult ones. Meanwhile, in economy class, Keanu had overheard most of Madison's confession. He had not meant to eavesdrop, but the thin walls of the airplane cabin offered little privacy. He sat very still for a long moment, his mother's hand still in his mind working through everything he had just heard. Patricia stirred beside him, sensing the shift in his energy. What is it, sweetheart? She murmured. Keanu hesitated, then he told her everything. When he finished, Patricia was quiet for a long time. Then she squeezed his hand and spoke in that soft, wise voice that had guided him through every difficult moment of his life. People are not their worst moments, she said simply. I taught you that. Now it is time to live it. Keanu looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the truth in her words reflected in her eyes. He thought about all the times people had given him second chances. All the times strangers had shown him kindness when he least deserved it. All the times grace had found him even when he had stopped looking for it. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. The cabin went still again. Passengers turned to watch as Keanu walked slowly toward the rear of the plane. Madison looked up as he approached, her eyes wide with fresh fear. She probably thought he was coming to deliver the final blow, to ensure her punishment was as severe as possible. Instead, Keanu stopped in front of her and crouched down so they were eye to eye. For a long moment, he said nothing. He simply looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not just the flight attendant who had mocked his mother, but the exhausted daughter carrying burdens too heavy for her young shoulders. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but clear enough for those nearby to hear. I am not here to hurt you, he said. I am here to help you. Madison stared at him, disbelief written across her face. I don't understand, she whispered. Keanu reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook and pen. He scribbled quickly, tore out the page, and handed it to her. This is the number for the best dementia care specialist in Los Angeles, he said. She helped my family when we were going through something similar. Call her tomorrow. Tell her I sent you. She will take your case personally. Madison took the paper with trembling fingers, her eyes filling with fresh tears. That's not all, Keanu continued. I am going to speak to Mr. Aldridge. I am going to ask him not to fire you. I am going to ask him to give you leave to get the help you need for your mother and for yourself. And I am going to personally fund that help, therapy, respite care, whatever you need. Madison shook her head violently. No, she choked out, you can't, after what I did. After what you did, Keanu interrupted gently, I am choosing to see the person underneath. Because someone did that for me once. Because my mother taught me that mercy matters more than punishment. Because I believe you can be better than this moment. Madison broke then, truly broke. Great, heaving sobs racked her body as she covered her face with her hands. Helen stepped forward and wrapped an arm around her shoulders, holding her as she cried. Keanu stood up and turned to find Victor Aldridge watching from a few feet away, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," Keanu said. Victor nodded. "Yes, we do." As the plane touched down on the runway with a gentle bump, applause finally rippled through the cabin, not for the landing, but for something far more rare, for unexpected grace, for undeserved mercy, for the quiet power of choosing kindness over cruelty. But outside the airport, waiting in the wings, was a storm Keanu and Madison could not yet see. The video had gone viral. News vans were already lining the terminal. Reporters shouted questions before the doors had even opened. Social media was exploding with outrage and demands for justice. Madison's name was trending worldwide. And not everyone believed in second chances. The morning light filtered through the airport windows with a softness that seemed to contradict everything waiting outside. Passengers shuffled off the plane slowly, their faces tired but curious, many of them glancing back toward Keanu and his mother as if reluctant to leave before the story was finished. The air inside the terminal felt different from the recycled cabin atmosphere, fresher somehow, though it carried its own kind of weight. Somewhere beyond the glass doors, camera flashes were already popping like tiny lightning strikes, and the distant hum of shouted questions leaked through the walls like water through cracks. Patricia walked slowly beside her son, her arm linked through his, her steps careful on the polished floor. She had not spoken much since the plane landed, but her silence was not empty. It was full of thoughts, of memories, of the quiet wisdom that comes from watching the world for nearly 8 decades. She knew what awaited them outside. She knew that this story had already escaped the confines of one airplane and spread across the entire world. And she knew that what happened next would matter more than anything that had come before. In a small conference room near the arrival gates, Victor Aldridge sat at a rectangular table with his hands folded in front of him. His phone lay face down beside him, silenced but still vibrating every few seconds with calls and messages he was ignoring. Across from him sat Madison, her face washed clean of makeup and tears, her eyes red but dry now. Helen sat beside her, one hand resting on Madison's arm in quiet support. The airline's legal counsel had wanted to be present, but Victor had sent him away. Some conversations needed to happen without lawyers in the room. The door opened and Keanu entered, followed by Patricia. Madison looked up at them and immediately dropped her gaze to the table, shame coloring her cheeks fresh pink. Patricia studied the young woman for a long moment, her expression impossible to read. Then she released her son's arm and walked around the table to where Madison sat. Everyone held their breath. Patricia pulled out the empty chair beside Madison and sat down slowly, her joints protesting the movement but her determination overriding the discomfort. She reached out and gently lifted Madison's chin until their eyes met. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. The silence stretched between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Then Patricia smiled. It was a small smile, weathered by years and softened by sorrows, but it was real. It was genuine. It was the kind of smile that could only come from someone who had learned that bitterness was a poison you drink yourself. "Tell me about your mother," Patricia said softly. Madison blinked, clearly caught off guard by the request. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her eyes filled with fresh tears that she fought to hold back. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely more than a whisper. "Her name is Grace," Madison said. "She was a teacher for 30 years, 3rd grade. She loved her students like they were her own children. She used to say that every child deserves someone who believes in them, even when they don't believe in themselves." Patricia nodded slowly. "She sounds wonderful." "She was," Madison whispered. "She was the best person I ever knew, and now she doesn't even remember my name most days. She looks at me like I am a stranger. And sometimes I catch myself being angry at her for forgetting. And then I hate myself for feeling that way because none of this is her fault." The tears finally spilled over, running down Madison's cheeks in silent streams. She made no move to wipe them away. She just sat there, exposed and vulnerable, all her defenses stripped away by exhaustion and guilt and grief. Patricia reached out and took Madison's hand in both of hers. Her skin was thin and marked with age spots, but her grip was surprisingly firm. "I understand," Patricia said, "more than you know. Watching someone you love disappear piece by piece is the hardest thing a heart can bear. It makes you feel helpless. It makes you feel angry, and sometimes that anger spills out onto people who don't deserve it. That doesn't make you evil, it makes you human." Madison shook her head. "But what I said to you on the plane, it was unforgivable." Patricia was quiet for a moment, considering the word. Then she squeezed Madison's hand gently. "Nothing is unforgivable," she said, "not if you are truly sorry, not if you are willing to grow from it. I have watched my son face cruelty his whole life. I have watched him lose people he loved more than life itself, his best friend, his daughter, the woman he wanted to spend forever with. The world gave him every reason to become hard and bitter and closed off. He didn't. Do you know why?" Madison shook her head again, her eyes fixed on Patricia's face. "Because he chose differently," Patricia continued. "Every single day he wakes up and chooses kindness over anger. He chooses compassion over judgment. He chooses to believe that people can be better than their worst moments. That is not weakness. That is the greatest strength a person can have." She turned to look at her son, who stood near the door with his hands in his pockets, watching the scene unfold with glistening eyes. "I did not teach him that," Patricia said softly. "Life taught him that. Loss taught him that. But I like to think I planted the seeds, and now he is planting them in you." Keanu stepped forward and pulled out a chair beside his mother, sitting down so that all four of them formed a small circle around the corner of the table. Victor Aldridge remained silent, watching, listening, his businessman's mind struggling to process what his heart was witnessing. "Madison," Keanu said gently, "I am not going to pretend that what you did was okay. It wasn't. My mother deserved better. Every passenger on that plane deserved better. But I also know that you were not being your true self last night. You were being the version of yourself that pain and exhaustion and fear had created. That version is not who you have to be tomorrow." He leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that was somehow both fierce and gentle. "I meant what I said on the plane," he continued. "I am going to help you, but I need something from you in return. I need you to commit to getting better, not just for your job, not just to avoid punishment, but for yourself, for your mother, for every person you will meet for the rest of your life who deserves to see the real Madison, not the broken one." Madison swallowed hard. How, she asked, how do I even begin? Keanu glanced at Victor, who straightened in his chair, sensing that his moment had arrived. "Mr. Aldridge," Keanu said, "what happens next is ultimately your decision. But I am asking you person to person, not celebrity to executive, to consider mercy. Not because Madison deserves it, maybe she doesn't, but because mercy has a power that punishment will never have. It transforms people. It heals wounds. It creates ripples that spread far beyond the moment itself." Victor was silent for a long time. He looked at Madison, at her tear-stained face and trembling hands. He looked at Patricia, at the grace and dignity she carried despite being the victim in this situation. He looked at Keanu, at a man who had every right to demand vengeance but was asking for forgiveness instead. Then he thought about his own life, his own failures, the times he had snapped at employees under pressure, the times he had put profit over people, the times he had been given second chances he probably did not deserve. He let out a slow breath and made his decision. "Madison," he said finally, "I am not going to fire you." Madison's head snapped up, disbelief flooding her features. But Victor continued, holding up a hand. "There are conditions. You will take an immediate leave of absence, 6 months minimum. During that time, you will receive full pay and benefits. You will attend therapy sessions to address the burnout and grief you have been carrying. You will work with the resources Mr. Reeves has offered to get proper care for your mother. And when you return, if you return, you will complete additional training in customer service and emotional regulation." He paused, letting the words sink in. "This is not a reward," he clarified. "This is an investment in you, in your potential, in the person Patricia and Keanu believe you can become. Do not waste it." Madison broke down completely then. Great, heaving sobs shook her entire body as the weight of everything finally came crashing down. Helen wrapped her arms around the young woman and held her tightly, murmuring soft words of comfort. Patricia watched with tears streaming down her own weathered cheeks. She had seen many things in her 78 years, but this moment would stay with her forever. This moment when punishment was set aside and grace took its place. This moment when a stranger became something more. Keanu reached over and took his mother's hand, squeezing it gently. She looked at him and smiled through her tears. "I am proud of you," she whispered, "so proud." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it softly. "Everything I am," he replied, "is because of you." Outside the conference room, the chaos continued. News vans multiplied. Reporters shouted questions. Social media raged with demands for justice and accountability. The hashtag #FireMedicine had reached over 2 million posts. Some people were calling for boycotts. Others were sending death threats to an address that had been illegally leaked online. But inside that small room, something precious was being built, something fragile and beautiful and rare. A bridge between strangers, a choice to see humanity instead of headlines, a decision to plant seeds of kindness in soil that everyone else had written off as barren. 1 year later, Madison Chen stood in the aisle of a plane that had just landed at LAX. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her uniform pressed and crisp, her smile warm and genuine. The past 12 months had changed her in ways she was still discovering. Therapy had helped her process the grief and anger she had been carrying. The dementia specialist Keanu had connected her with had transformed her mother's care, giving Grace dignity and comfort in her final chapter. And the time away from work had allowed Madison to remember why she had wanted to be a flight attendant in the first place. Not for the travel or the glamour, but for the chance to make difficult journeys a little easier for people who were scared or tired or alone. She had returned to the airline 3 months ago, specifically requesting to work flights with high numbers of elderly passengers. Her supervisors had been hesitant at first, worried about putting her back in situations that might trigger old patterns. But Madison had insisted. She wanted to prove to herself most of all that she was not defined by her worst moment. Today, as passengers filed off the plane, Madison noticed an elderly woman struggling with her carry-on bag. The woman was small and frail, with white hair and hands that trembled slightly as she reached for the overhead compartment. Madison was beside her in an instant. "Let me help you with that," she said warmly, lifting the bag down with practiced ease. "First-class treatment for everyone. That is how we do things now." The woman looked up at her with surprised gratitude. "Thank you, dear. That is very kind of you." Madison smiled, and the smile reached all the way to her eyes. "It is my pleasure," she replied, truly. As the woman shuffled toward the exit, Madison reached up and touched the small pin on her uniform collar. It was simple and elegant, just 3 words etched in silver. "Kindness is free." Patricia had given it to her at their first meeting outside the airport, 6 months into Madison's leave. They had stayed in touch through letters and occasional phone calls, an unlikely friendship born from an unlikely moment. Patricia had told Madison stories about Keanu's childhood, about the struggles they had faced together, about the choices that had shaped him into the man he became. And Madison had shared her own stories about her mother, about her fears, about the person she was trying to become. At the end of that meeting, Patricia had pressed the pin into Madison's palm and closed her fingers around it. "Wear this when you go back to work," Patricia had said. "Let it remind you every day that the smallest kindnesses often matter the most. A smile costs nothing. A gentle word costs nothing. But they can change everything for someone who is struggling." Madison had worn the pin every single day since. Now, as the last passengers exited the plane, she walked slowly through the empty cabin, checking seats and overhead compartments. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out to find a message from an unknown number. "Saw the interview you did with the airline magazine," the message read. "Proud of you. Keep planting seeds. Signed, K." Madison smiled and slipped the phone back into her pocket. The interview had been her idea, a way to share her story publicly and hopefully help others who were struggling with caregiver burnout. She had been nervous about the attention, about reopening wounds that had only recently begun to heal. But Keanu had encouraged her to do it. "Your story can help people," he had told her during one of their occasional phone calls. "It can show them that rock bottom is not the end. It is just a place where you decide what direction to grow." He was right, of course. The response to the interview had been overwhelming. Hundreds of people had reached out to share their own stories of burnout and breakdown and redemption. Support groups had formed. Resources had been shared. A foundation had been started in Grace's name to help caregivers access mental health services. Out of one terrible moment, something beautiful had grown. Madison finished her walkthrough and headed toward the exit. As she stepped into the jetway, she paused and looked back at the empty plane one more time. She thought about the flight 1 year ago that had changed everything. She thought about Patricia's grace and Keanu's mercy. She thought about Victor's decision to invest in her potential instead of punishing her failure. And she made a silent promise to honor all of it, every single day, for the rest of her life. The lessons we carry. This story began with cruelty and ended with kindness. It began with judgment and ended with grace. It began with a moment that could have destroyed a young woman's life and ended with a transformation that touched thousands. What can we learn from it? First, that people are not their worst moments. Madison made a terrible mistake on that airplane. She was cruel when she should have been kind. She was dismissive when she should have been caring. But underneath that behavior was a person in pain, a person carrying burdens too heavy for her shoulders, a person who had lost sight of her own values in the fog of exhaustion and grief. When Patricia and Keanu chose to see beyond her actions to her humanity, they gave her the chance to become someone better. Second, that kindness costs nothing but changes everything. A gentle word, a helping hand, a moment of patience with someone who is struggling. These small acts seem insignificant in the moment, but they ripple outward in ways we can never fully measure. Patricia could have demanded punishment. Keanu could have used his fame to destroy Madison's life. Instead, they planted seeds of grace that grew into something beautiful. Third, that we all need second chances. Every single one of us has failed at some point. We have said things we regret. We have hurt people who did not deserve it. We have been less than our best selves when the pressure became too much. The question is not whether we will fail, but what we will do afterward. And equally important, what we will do when others fail us. Will we demand perfection, or will we offer the same mercy we hope to receive? Fourth, that strength is not the absence of pain, but the refusal to let pain make us cruel. Keanu Reeves has faced losses that would break most people. He has buried friends and lovers and a daughter who never got to take her first breath. Yet he moves through the world with gentleness and humility, choosing every day to spread light instead of darkness. That is true strength. That is the kind of person we can all aspire to become. And finally, that the world watches how we treat the powerless. Madison did not know that Keanu was on that plane. She did not know that a corporate executive was observing her every move. She thought she was safe to be unkind because her victim was just an old woman traveling alone. But the truth is that every interaction matters. Every choice reveals who we really are. We should treat everyone with dignity, not because someone important might be watching, but because everyone is important. Every person we meet is carrying struggles we cannot see. Every person deserves our basic respect. Keanu Reeves inspires me because he understands these truths and lives them daily. He reminds us that fame does not have to corrupt, that success does not have to harden, that the highest achievement a person can reach is not wealth or recognition, but a heart that remains open to others. Patricia Reeves raised a son who became a star, but more importantly, she raised a son who became a good man. Her legacy is not the costumes she designed or the movies her hands helped create. Her legacy is the kindness she planted in her child's heart, kindness that has now spread to millions of people around the world. And Madison Chen, once the villain of this story, became proof that redemption is possible for all of us. She took the second chance she was given and transformed it into a mission to help others. She did not run from her failure. She learned from it. She grew from it. She let it shape her into someone stronger and kinder and more compassionate than she had ever been before. That is the power of this story, not that a celebrity defended his mother on an airplane, not that a flight attendant was caught being cruel, but that in a world obsessed with punishment and outrage and tearing people down, a small group of people chose a different path. They chose mercy. They chose growth. They chose love. And in doing so, they reminded all of us what is possible when we lead with our hearts instead of our anger. The next time you encounter someone being difficult or unkind, remember this story. Remember that you do not know what battles they are fighting. Remember that your response can either add to their pain or begin their healing. Remember that kindness is free and that grace has a power that punishment will never match. Be the person who plants seeds of compassion in barren soil. Be the person who sees humanity in those who have forgotten their own. Be the person who chooses, every single day, to make the world a little gentler than you found it. That is the lesson of this story. That is the legacy of kindness. That is how we rise above the clouds.